Hello everyone, this is part 19 of What If Naruto Was the Perfect Shinobi, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Be sure to like and subscribe, it gives me more motivation. Enjoy. Sarutobi glared down onto the impromptu battleground atop his mud wall, utilizing the highest ground as a vantage point. The battle seemed to be hopeless, however. The Sandaime had not at all been prepared to have Orochimaru use such a vile technique as Edo Tensei, though he should have been in retrospect. The snake Sanen's corrupt nature knew no limits. Somewhere submerged within the standing water around the wall, the Shodai and Nadaime were waiting. The Hokage turned his angered expression onto his estranged apprentice, who stood a good distance removed watching his puppets dance. The moment Sarutobi diverted his attention, two sharp water streams shot out through the lake below in rapid succession, tearing into the third's earthen perch in a crisscrossing pattern and tearing down the section on which the old man stood. The outnumbered and overmatched Hokage cursed under his breath and hopped along the collapsing wreckage in an attempt to avoid being crushed underneath. Having to deal with these two at once is too much. I'm too damned old for this. Sarutobi landed on his hands and knees panting, the battle's rapid pace being more than his age-reduced capacities could match. The ceiling tiles beneath him cracked and shattered and a tree sapling burst through, growing at an impossible rate. The old man's expression turned to shock as he stared over to where the Shodai had his hands together in a seal, enormous roots springing outward all around both Cage-class shinobi. The Shodai's original power, this is no good. There's no counter. Mokuton Haijutsu, Jukai Kutiten. The Sandaime bit his thumb as the growth accelerated even more. A gigantic tree generated beneath the old Hokage and shoved him high into the air. Yet more roots and branches appeared through the tiled ground in various places, also sprouting through the mud wall and soon covering the entire battleground in a botanical hell. Sarutobi leapt about the branches, moving to avoid being trapped or crushed as the trees came together while attempting to reach the ground again. As he was about to reach his destination, the Shodai let out a warshout and more branches sent out through the splintered mud wall. The limbs wrapped around the Sandaime's chest and pinning his arms in position while a second branch bound his legs. His task complete, the first Hokage ceased his summoning and stood silent with his arms at his sides while Orochimaru sauntered over to take a closer look and revel in his accomplishment. You've been caught, Sarutobi-sensei. How anticlimactic. The Nadaime trudged over to stand next to his reincarnated brother. Sarutobi struggled against his wooden bonds to glare down at his arrogant student, maintaining the serpent man's amusement as he reached down to smear the blood on his thumb against a near limb. I can't win this alone, it seems, Ninpu Kuchios, Enku, Enma. The area exploded in white smoke, concealing Sarutobi's position while Orochimaru's pleased expression narrowed with suspicion. The cloud soon subsided, revealing a large white-haired ape garbed in shinobi clothing and wearing a Konoha Haitai 8. Enma stood on the branch, peering around at the scene that greeted him upon arrival. HMPH, something troublesome has appeared, cursed that old man and his pet baboon. The regal summoned beast turned to regard the speaker, padding down the branch to gain a better vantage point. The ape king glared upon recognizing his summoner's errant pupil. The Sandaime remembered that Enma had advised him to set title Orochimaru long ago. Would that he had listened then. So, it's Orochimaru, I knew this would happen sooner or later. Enma snorted and turned back to regard Sarutobi, wearing a disapproving look. You must be regretting now, Sarutobi. You ought to have cared him back then. And now it's too late. The third sighed and said nothing in response, having been prepared to hear those words and knowing that Enma was correct in them. Sarutobi had since regretted his past indecision countless times, knowing well now that he indeed should have executed Orochimaru over a decade earlier upon discovering the Snake Man's human experiments. Sarutobi hadn't been able to summon the resolve to kill his prized student, and now the whole village was stuck with the consequences. There's still a chance to correct the past now. Enma, lend strength to this old man one last time. Please, change into the Kongo Nyoi. Enma moved into a combat stance as Orochimaru commanded both the Shodai and Nadaime to attack. The two armored shinobi scampered along the tree trunk. Enma clubbed the second with an overhead hammer blow as the blue-garbed Hokage approached, sending him crashing down through the trunk to the ground beneath the tree. The summoned beast then whirled about to block the Shodai's soaring kick with one hand, sending him careening into the air with a crossing punch using the other. All right then. Let's see whether you can end it. Enma assumed a complex pose and exploded into smoke, changing into a thick black pole with golden tips on either end, as hard as diamond and sharp as a masterpiece katatana. The sentient weapon shot towards the bound Sarutobi, subbing through the wooden ropes on one side and then spinning about to into the constricting limbs on the other. Now broken loose, the Sandaime Hokage caught the changed Enma in hand and leapt onto a large root, below which an amused Orochimaru was waiting to meet him. At least things are at last starting to get a little interesting. Coo coo coo. The snake Sannin stared into the clouds overhead through the violet barrier, opening his mouth wide and extending his tongue. The appendage morphed into a snake, though whose mouth then protruded a sword's handle. Kusanagi whipped into the air and back to earth, and Orochimaru caught the straight blade with ease. Sarutobi leveled a stare on the Jian sword in the heavy Sennin's hands as Orochimaru took several idle practice swings. Kusanagi no Tsurugi, it's deplorable to see that this sacred instrument of the heavens has acknowledged such a vile fiend as its wielder. Not even the Kongo Nyoi can withstand its edge without suffering harm. I will have to end this contest quickly for Enma's sake. I'm so glad this last month has given me these chances to rediscover Kenjutsu, sensei. You'll be a much more suitable opponent than Naruto-kun or that weakling Kazekage. The third ran along the thick root's length to build some momentum and sprang high into the air, straining his aged muscles to gain as much speed as possible, and commanded his weapon to extend down to impale Orochimaru. The Sannin ducked aside and evaded the blow, which pulverized the tile ground where it impacted, and somersaulted across the area to create more distance between the two. Sarutobi meanwhile used his elongated pole to vault onto level ground with his opponent and charged again. The Sandaime used his weapon's superior reach to keep Orochimaru backpedaling, not allowing the Serpent Man to get close enough to launch an attack. The battle continued in this strain through several exchanges. Orochimaru moved his head with an almost liquid grace to dodge several well-aimed thrusts, then using his sword's blunt side to intercept one last aimed at his chest, creating a slock as the Sandaime attempted to break past his guard while the Serpent Shinobi tried to push him back and retake the initiative. Orochimaru seemed to be losing the contest, but the sudden sneer on his lips gave Sarutobi pause. The old warrior glanced to the side right in time to glimpse the charging Shodai, who clipped his legs out with a running sweep. The third somersaulted with the impact and landed upright while still holding his weapon, but to no avail as the Nadaime appeared astride and kicked the Kongo Nyoi aside with a high roundhouse, then sending Sarutobi spinning along the rain-slicked ground with a reverse kick to the head. This is the chance, here I come, Sarutobi-sensei. Seeing his opening, Orochimaru planted Kusanagi into the ground and rushed his old sensei at top speed. The snake Sannin punished the rubber-legged Sarutobi with several hard punches and executed a leaping crossover kick that impacted the aged shinobi's mandible and sent him sprawling to the ground in pain. Sarutobi's ears were ringing and he was more than a little winded and disoriented. These odds are too much to overcome. I was a fool to allow this to happen. The Hokage had allowed his student to bring him to an isolated location to battle without mounting much resistance, even though Naruto's ill-advised attack on the man while he was still wearing the Yondaime Kazekage's skin had granted him more than ample time to do so. Sarutobi had wanted to settle his past mistakes alone, without placing the spectators or his shinobi at risk. But now the Sandaime was alone and outnumbered, his limited stamina running short, and Orochimaru hadn't even broken a sweat. But still, the village was secure, and Naruto was long gone where the snake couldn't get at him no matter what happened here. Foolish indeed, sensei, to charge at me without even creating clones. Sarutobi's head lolled to the side, as the old man tried to tune out the masked Anbu gathered around outside the barrier, who were now shouting in alarm but helpless to give much more than verbal support despite being among Konoha village's most elite soldiers. Someone then took hold onto his collar and hoisted him to a sitting position. The aged Hokage mustered his precious strength to look into Orochimaru's leering visage. The evil Sannin began to cackle with insane glee at his beaten teacher's wretched condition. Come on now, old man. You can do better than this, please don't disappoint me so. Enma's voice likewise chided the Sandaime, while Orochimaru diverted his concentration to taunt the Anbu lingering about outside. This is miserable, Sarutobi. You have to stop holding back and put an end to this. For a long moment, Sarutobi stared into space as a lone tear rolled down his wrinkled cheek. The old man's vision became harzed, and he thought he glimpsed his so long gone pupil rather than the twisted man he had become in the person leering over him. His remorse wouldn't last long, however. Sarutobi let out a snarl and grabbed Orochimaru's wrists, then locking the snake's right ankle between his legs, twisting hard to take out his knee and wrench him to the ground. The heavy Sennin gasped in surprise and pain, and Sarutobi stunned him with a quick kick to the chin while Enma's muscled arm materialized through the Kongo Nyoi. The massive warrior ape's paw wasted no time in making a beeline towards the snake man's tea. Orochimaru managed to react in time to avoid having his end snapped, much to the third's chagrin. Senejashu. Orochimaru's signature shadow snakes burst through his stabilive and wrapped around Enma's wrist, halting its advance towards the snake man. The serpents tore into Sarutobi's companion, releasing their venom with their bites. The regal ape howled in rage, and a second arm emerged and closed around the snakes, crushing their NS into paste with a single clench. Their intended work had been accomplished, however, as Sarutobi noted with a grim expression. The Kongo Nyoi disappeared in a white smoke cloud, leaving the reverted Enma cradling his wounded right arm while glaring at the grinning snake Sannin. Ugh, I was too careless. Damn. Sarutobi glanced at the poisoned Enma, whose arm was even then beginning to change color where Orochimaru's snakes had bitten him. That moment's distraction proved a mistake, as the serpent man closed quarters and booted him clear across the battleground. The Sandaime collided with his own weathered mud wall with a sickening crack, groaning in pain as he slid down the structure onto the rubble that the Nadaime's earlier water assault had created. The third twitched on the ground, his aged huskill having absorbed more punishment than it could withstand. Coo, like bringing some miserable beast like that could change the outcome. I've squandered more than enough precious time on such a miserable old man, so I'm calling an end to our little reunion right here, Sarutobi-sensei. The dark clouds overhead parted as Orochimaru advanced, the rain stopped and the sun emerged as bright as Sarutobi had ever seen. As the Sandaime averted his tired gaze to escape the blinding glare, several tree limbs sprouted through the mud wall and bound him in position once more. His tea locked in stasis, Sarutobi had no choice but to stare into the skillies, and there he glimpsed the largest, most brilliant rainbow he had seen in all his near 7 decades. The sight, while gorgeous to behold, was not a pleasant one in the least, as he well understood what it meant. The rainbow, a natural sign favoring the serpent, I see, this is where it all ends. Sarutobi cursed his past mistakes in addition to his having been too brittle and weak to punish Orochimaru now, as the Sannin motioned with his hand and Kusanagi began to levitate and glow with a pure white light. The Sandaime gritted his teeth, unwilling to show weakness in his last moments. He would at least a proud warrior, and honor his village and the position he had so long occupied. Orochimaru waved his arm and the sword streaked at Sarutobi at high speed, the third being unable to move to dodge. Right as Kusanagi was set to impale the Sandaime Hokage, the wounded Enma leapt into its path. The white blade LD through the brave summon's shoulder as though it were mere scroll paper, splashing blood onto Sarutobi. Enma used his remaining good hand to grab onto the weapon, holding it to ensure Orochimaru would not be able to call it again. Enma, there was no need. Sarutobi hung his head in remorse, as much as his bonds allowed. The Sandaime's oldest companion regarded him with a pained grin while blood continued to seep through the puncture wound in his shoulder. Nonsense, Sarutobi. You and this village, I will protect him to the bitter end. I wish that I could have done more to help. A titanic water dragon then crashed into Enma, sending the ape rolling along the ground towards the barrier, still maintaining his iron grip on Orochimaru's Kusanagi. The Sandaime sent a harsh glare at the puppet Nadaime, even though he knew that his reincarnated sensei had no control over his actions. The stoic blue-armored warrior even had visible remorse showing in his expression, as though he regretted his role in this battle despite being unable to stop. The sight tore at Sarutobi's aching heart. Enma's beating chest showed that he was still alive, though unable to move. Orochimaru cackled aloud, his vile presence corrupting the somber scene. Futile. Well, I suppose ending this with these hands will be more rewarding as well. The snake Sanin brought his pale hands together and began sealing what Sarutobi recognized as a high-level wind ninjutsu. The shearing impact would shred him to pieces. At that critical moment, an enormous new chakra resonated in the air overhead. The Hokage wrenched his head to stare at the presence, and glimpsed something amazing. Floating astride the rainbow overhead and obscured in the sun's glare was a strange winged silhouette. Orochimaru seemed to notice the phenomenon as well, as he cancelled his near-complete sealing and looked over into the air as well with an enraptured expression, as did the Shodai and Nadaime in unison. Sarutobi could hear his own heartbeat in the silence, as the exotic creature began its descent into the battleground. XXXXXXXXXX. Kiba and the other genin came to a halt in the woods upon coming across an unconscious Aberrane Shino collapsed on a tree limb near where a chakra-exhausted Sabaku no Kankuro was twitching in the mud, covered in Kikaichu. Sakura and Ino rushed over to check on the downed comrade. The blonde Kunoichi crouched over him and pressed a hand against the insect user's brow. Ino's voice was laced with dread. His skin is hot to the touch, he's been poisoned, and it's had time to spread. Kankuro groaned and rolled over in the mud, smirking as he attempted to stand, but was unable to muster the wherewithal. His unwrapped puppet was motionless in the bushes, clogged with insects so that it was useless. His kabuki paint had run and smudged both with the rain and his sweat, and his black hooded suit was brown with wet mud. Still, the Kagutsu Prakshana panted and let out a harsh chuckle, amusement mixed with resignation, as though he knew he was doomed but was still intent on having the last laugh. Hey, right in one, sweetheart. He'll be soon as poisons are second to none. The Konoha genin all turned to stare down at the prone Sannin with disgust. Kiba marched over with a bestial snarl and grabbed his collar with both hands, causing his hood to drop and revealing Kankura's short, sand-brown hair. Using his considerable strength, the Inuzuka hoisted the puppet artist into the air and slammed him against a rough oak tree trunk. The impact opened a laceration behind the Suna genin's head that oozed thick, dark blood down the bark. Kiba closed into him, their noses mere millimeters apart, and bared his pointed canine teeth. You'd better start talking right now, asshole. Give us the antidote, or else. Rather than being intimidated, Kankuro laughed in his rasping, exhausted voice in response to Kiba's crude attempt at interrogation. Don't threaten me, punk. All you Konoha losers can do is K me, and I'd rather in battle with honor here than have to go back home in shame. And I haven't got an antivnon, either, cause there isn't one. Karasu's poison is extra special. Tough he's a goner. I lost the battle, but now it seems like I've won the war. Hey hey hey. Sakura let out an enraged scream and leaped down at Kankuro, drawing a kunai. Without even stopping to think, the kunoichi pushed Kiba's arm aside and sheathed the blade to the handle in the Sannin's chest, piercing his heart. Blood ran out onto her slender hands, staining them crimson. The late Kazekage's eldest son stared in complete shock at the steel weapon piercing his heart, not believing that what had happened an instant earlier was real. Kiba and Ino, and even Shikamaru wore identical shellacked expressions as the three gawked at Sakura, who was staring at her own bloodstained hands with no less shock and horror than the shinobi she had delivered a death blow to. Kankuro looked over and met his cur's stare. Goo, I remember now. You're that weak little B Temari smacked around in the prelims. She'll be sure to scold me over getting ked like this. Sis, I wish I could have seen our home village one last time. Please, get out of this hole alive, and, Gaara, I'm. Kankuro couldn't have known that his hope was in vain, that Temari had preceded him into the next world. He sucked in a breath, convulsed several times and went slack against the tree, Sakura's hand still connected to the blade in his chest and soaked with his blood down to her wrist. She stood there, shaking once the adrenaline pushing her actions subsided, struggling to come to terms with what she'd done in a blind rage. It was like an instinct, he was gloating about King Shino, and then Thus was the incomparable bond that existed among teammates. Something Naruto would not have understood had the blonde been present. No one among those present blamed Sakura, and still the Konoha genin shared a moment's collective silence concerning the Suna shinobi's passing. Though a hostile soldier, he was still a human being like them, with hopes and ambitions and people precious to him. Ino turned to conduct a basic check on Shino's vitals. He's still alive, but he's in bad shape. We need to get him into the hospital, quick. The medics will be able to remove the poison without an antidote. Kiba wanted to rush Shino back to the village at once, the mission be damned. Shikamaru pinched his nose in irritation and gave his strategic opinion on the matter. The shadow manipulator empathized with the Inuzukas wanting to save the other genin, but there were standing orders to consider, and getting into trouble because he ignored his mission would be troublesome. Look, we've got two choices. We can abort the mission and take Shino here back to the village, and abandon Sasuke, or we can accept that it might be too late to save Shino and continue on. We can't split up. We've got one guide and we all need him to not get lost here. And besides, this is a war zone. Dividing our numbers could get us all killed. The other three stood silent, contemplating Shikamaru's conclusions. Ino spoke at last in a low whisper. You make the call, forehead. You're their teammate, not us. A rough decision all around, whether to abandon a wounded comrade to an agonizing end in order to complete the mission. To choose between a marginal chance to save one person and a likewise marginal chance to locate another. These were the choices team leaders had to make, and having such a call thrust onto her shoulders sat not so well with Haruno Sakura. The girl hesitated, biting her lip while looking between Shino and the horizon where her other male teammate was located. Akamaru let out a bark towards that same area. A rustling in the bushes captured their attention, and the moral crisis was averted when Uchiha Sasuke landed in the mud alongside them. The Sharingan wielder seemed as surprised to see them as the other genin were relieved to see him. You all, so, Kakashi decided to send in some backup, I see. Sasuke seemed somewhat lethargic and preoccupied, nowhere near alert as usual. His Sharingan was inactive, even while in a zone where hostile shinobi were known to be present. Also, he would glance at his right hand, where the skin was somewhat charred and bleeding, and shudder, shaking his raven head as though to clear some unwanted vision. The Uchiha was pale and wore an almost haunted expression, coping with some ongoing nightmare while slumping over with mild chakra exhaustion. Sasuke's overall condition was similar to what Naruto's had been when Orochimaru had bitten the blonde and given him his Juin during the Chunin exams. Sakura and Ino exchanged a concerned look. Sasuke-kun, Shino's been poisoned. Sasuke blinked in surprise and seemed to regain his bearings on the spot, moving onto the low branch to check his teammate's condition as well, also casting a glance towards Kankura's corpse and then looking aside. Without hesitation, the Uchiha took the Abarame's listless arm and drd it over his own shoulders, hoisting his poisoned comrade as he leapt back down onto solid ground. Then we've got no time to waste. I've received orders to evacuate to the village. No one bothered to question him, the genin having completed their mission. Sasuke stumbled on his landing and almost allowed Shino to plummet into the mud, his two Chidori as well as various other chakra techniques and also traveling at high speed to keep pace with the Suna siblings having taxed his reserves. Kiba moved in and caught the insect use his other arm and drd it over his shoulders. Sasuke and Kiba then worked together to raise Shino again, both putting their mutual Naruto-induced dislike aside to rescue their silent comrade. The genin thus began their return trip to the village while racing against the clock, with Sakura, Ino and Shikamaru all taking protective positions surrounding Sasuke and Kiba, who were both supporting the unconscious Shino on their shoulders. XXXXXXXXXX. Freedom. I've waited so long, perhaps I'll cause a little destruction to celebrate. Yamato gritted his teeth beneath his Anbu mask as he looked at the titanic Biju. Control abilities or not, this monster was a tall order, and Naruto was still nowhere to be seen. The cage-level snake summoning the blonde Jinchuriki was known to be able to execute would make this battle much less hazardous. The captain knew that he had to have run against something huge to be gone this long, as Naruto wasn't one to abandon his mission, much less one given via the Hokage's direct orders. With Orochimaru's odd interest in him, it was probable that the old pale-skinned blackguard had sent some servant or team out with orders to challenge the lieutenant. Haw haw, I think that village will be a tempting target, so much blood, delicious. The Ichibi swiveled his earthen-colored head around, training his gaze on Konoha. Yamato had no doubts that the demon could view the entire village with its towering height. The revived monster took a moment to stretch its long unused limbs and then began stalking towards the village whilst slamming its massive tail against the ground. The captain brought his hands together in a seal as the Ichibi began another step, causing a large tree to sprout and grow beneath its one grounded leg. I'd hoped it wouldn't come to a complete manifestation, still, I've got to keep that thing occupied until I can figure out how to repress its chakra. The beast stumbled in surprise, but used its tail as a crutch in order to remain standing. Tenzu grimaced and channeled more chakra into his technique, making the tree's trunk morph and twist around the demon's leg. The Sand Titanuki swiveled his gaze around in the rain, seeking the impetuous mortal who had used these same attacks against its Jinchuriki earlier, but having a hard time locating him due to the trees. At last he looked straight down and noticed Yamato standing in the mud. The greater demon threw back his head and let out a mad cackle. Aha! How amusing! A human has the gall to challenge the invincible Shukaku. The Biju brought its raised leg crashing down onto Yamato's position. The captain managed to shunshanhai into a distant tree and avoided being crushed, but the Ichibi pulverized several trees with his stomp, reducing the potential spots Tenzu could use as cover. Shukaku, as Yamato had heard the raccoon demon use as his name, swung his tail in a sweeping arc at the trees, snapping and breaking several. The captain moved onto the ground again, as the Ichibi squealed with insane laughter and grabbed at the timber he had made, chucking the logs at the Anbu veteran. Yamato allowed a small smirk beneath his mask and unsheathed his wooden katatana, hacking apart the logs as quick as Shukaku could hurl them down. Hoo, a serious opponent. I'll take great pleasure in crushing that iron will. The Ichibi threw his last load down, and brought both palms slamming onto the ground behind the logs in another attempt to crush the Anbu. Tenzu sheathed his blade and ran between Shukaku's legs as the giant sand raccoon lunged over, leaping well to the side to respect the tail's reach. Yamato made several hand seals and the rainwater in the air and pulled on the ground near his position coalesced and swirled around him in a tight water spout. You will not harm our village, monster. Suten, Sushoa. The water tornado unleashed its spiral and rushed into Shukaku, crashing into the sand raccoon's back in a massive tidal wave. The Ichibi staggered with the impact, almost collapsing to its knees, but in an odd ironic twist, the tree that Yamato had bound around its earthen leg earlier served as a bracing mechanism. Soon enough the tree weathered apart in the assault tide, making the monster stumble again, but the attack did no noticeable damage overall, accomplishing little more than pestering the Biju. Bah! You're so irritating. Eat this then, little man. Shukaku sucked in a long breath, making its stomach expand, and wrenched the tree loose. The demon bounded high into the air, causing Tenzu to cancel his jutsu. Too late, however, as the Biju punched its own gut and expelled the trapped air with devastating results. The demon regurgitated the compressed wind as a gigantic spherical missile that launched towards Yamato's general position, causing a massive explosion when it impacted with the ground, knocking large trees down all around and creating a wrecked, barren clearing where a lush wood had once been. Tenzu managed to move in time to evade being torn to shreds in the actual wind blast, but the explosion's shockwaves were enough to send him crashing through the air. The captain landed hard on the SD timber he had made with his sword earlier, cracking his back and knocking his breath out. The rough crash also splintered his Anbu mask, which he raised a weak hand to remove and toss aside. MWA ha, nowhere to run now. You'll be crushed into paste. Yamato struggled to regain his bearings as Shukaku again attempted to stomp on him. However, as he tried to rise, he learned that he had sprained his leg on landing. Tenzu gritted his teeth, unable to move in time as the massive Biju descended on him. Suten, Tepudama, an enormous compressed water ball, comparable in size to Shukaku's earlier attack, slammed into the demon's unguarded side. This time the Ichibi couldn't help being knocked over, and slammed into the ground hard enough to cause a localized tremor. The incensed Biju glared into the near horizon with a shriek. Someone dares to meddle. Ah, and it's the boss toad with him. Begone, I'm not interested in drinking cold amphibian blood. While Shukaku scrambled to stand again, a massive orange-colored toad landed in the mud next to Tenzu. Dressed in Yakuza garb and bearing a huge Titanto blade strapped to his back, he was the Toad Court's Oyaban, Gamabunter. Yamato let out a relieved sigh when the new arrival appeared. There was but one man who could have summoned the Toad boss, the Gama Sennin, Jiraiya-sama. The Sannin was perched on Gamabunter's head, peering at Shukaku with a small hand scope. The Toad meanwhile captured Tenzu using his spackled tongue and placed the captain on his enormous back. You're the last person I expected to see here, Jiraiya-sama. The Toad hermit collapsed his scope and glanced back over his shoulder to regard Yamato. The old Sannin sported a roguish grin, reaching back behind his white hair to scratch his en in embarrassment. Jiraiya let out a mirthless chuckle, acknowledging the chiding truth behind the ANBU's comment, that he tended not to be around when needed. Hey, I happen to be hanging around the old neighborhood, that's all. All's quiet back in the village. Looks like Orochimaru screwed the pooch with this little invasion plot. I guessed some trouble was brewing out in these woods and thought I'd do Konoha a good turn and come on over to lend some support. You seem to have gotten into quite a mess here, Tenzu. Yamato gave a disgruntled nod, promising in his mind to read the riot act to a certain blonde lieutenant when this was over, as he used a minor medical ninjutsu to numb his wounded leg so that he could stand on it, at least in the short term. Tenzu gazed at the rising Shukaku. I was sent to deal with this beast, but it's been all I can handle to keep it occupied. Jiraiya likewise turned his attention back to the angered Biju as he sank into his prepared combat stance on Gamabunta's head. The toad hermit pointed with his thumb towards a certain place on Shukaku's back and tossed his scope to Yamato. Tenzu snapped open the scope and trained it on the spot his senior indicated, and saw that Sabaku no Gara was slumped over unconscious there, buried clear to his waist inside Shukaku's earthen-colored skin. You can leave that to us. We'll distract him. You go in and put a walloping on the Jinchuriki in the meantime. Shukaku needs the kid to be asleep to come out. Wake the Gaki up and the Ichibi will be vanquished. The captain nodded his understanding. However, Shukaku also overheard the Gama Sennin's comments and let out an enraged squeal, slamming its tail onto the ground several times in anger. No, 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 I won't be sent back inside that brat. You're all going to S instead. Jiraiya allowed an almost arrogant smirk, while Yamato steeled his nerves. HMPH. We'll see about that. Come on, Gamabunta, let's tighten this raccoon's hide. Gamabunta mirrored the Sannin's smirk around his pipe, brandishing his Titanto. Roger that, Jiraiya. You owe me a drink when this is all over, remember. The Ika author grimaced, considering how much damage a Gamabunta-sized booze bill would do to his poor pocketbook. The Toad Boss meanwhile leapt into the air. Yamato slammed down and latched onto the Grand Summon's overcoat with both hands, while Jiraiya remained standing upright on his head as though this were a mere stroll through Konoha's streets. The captain envied his courage. The Toad Boss blasted out another water missile in midair at the same time as Shukaku repeated the air blast. The two missiles collided and exploded, cancelling one another out. However, Shukaku closed quarters and swiped with its massive earthen paw as Gamabunta landed, catching the great toad's stomach with a harsh blow. The Oyoban slid back with the impact, planting his Titanto into the mud to halt his momentum. Gamabunta patted his stomach with a grimace, where a monster-sized welt was sprouting even then, and sprang into the area wettest and thickest with mud that he could locate. Ah, that one's gonna leave a mark. That'll be 2 drinks now, old man. Shukaku squealed in perverse delight and charged the toad again. Gamabunta was better prepared this time and struck out with his blade. The Biju ducked underneath the Titanto swipe and spun about, swinging its raccoon tail at the Toad Boss's side. The Oyoban predicted this attack as well, and allowed it to graze him, then catching the tail beneath his armpit. Gamabunta tossed his blade aside and pinned Shukaku's shoulder down with his other arm, doing the best he could with his webbed appendages to hold the demon into position long enough to give Jiraiya the time needed to execute his plan. The Titanuki squirmed and almost broke loose, sinking its pointed bite into Gamabunta's en. The toad exhibited true grit and hung on through the pain. The Sannin ran through several rapid-speed hand seals with an intense expression. You've stumbled right into our trap. Doton, Yomi Numa. The thick mud beneath the 2 massive combatitants swirled and deepened into a huge swamp, sinking both Shukaku and Gamabunta to the waist in muck. The Biju hissed and screamed as it was unable to escape the technique, clawing with both hands in an attempt to reach something solid to use as a brace. The Gama Sennin looked down at his marsh with an accomplished smile, while Gamabunta raised his head to speak. Make it quick. This won't hold him down long, and I'm weakening. Jiraiya nodded, looking around on Shukaku while he searched out a good landing point. Right, now's our chance, Tenzu, let's get moving and send this beast packing. The toad hermit measured his move and leapt onto the Biju with Tenzu trailing right behind. Shukaku meanwhile reached behind its back with tried to slap the 2 shinobi loose into the muck below. Yamato leapt aside while Jiraiya darted about here and there to distract the demon's attention while covering the unmasked captain's advance, and soon closed in on the sleeping Gaara. Tenzu sighed and slapped the Suna genin on his cheek with all his strength. When that wasn't enough to wake him, Yamato backhanded him with the same arm. Gaara stirred this time, and muttered in a low voice as he returned to his slumber. Sabaku Sausu. Shukaku's skin rose up beneath Tenzu's ankles and held him in position while sand sprang towards him around Gaara. Yamato snorted and whipped out Mikoboshi, slicing Gaara's desperate attack apart with ease, scattering the sand all over the place. Though he was still bound in place, the captain had enough reach to end this. Making Gaara awaken was proving bothersome, and so he would end the battle in another manner. The monster still needs its Yuki to remain out. Hokage Shiki Jijin Jutsu, Kakuen Nitten Sushu. Yamato slammed his palm into Gaara's chest, transplanting the special Biju repression seal onto the sleeping redhead. The demonic chakra that kept Shukaku's present incarnation out began to seep into the seal all around the pair, and the sand constituting him began to spill loose. Tenzu's knees weakened with exertion. Even though he was able to wield the same techniques, the captain was no Shodai Hokage, and repressing this much Yuki without the first Zenlace as a supplement was a grueling experience. The Ichibi screamed with hatred as its corporeal persona began to crumble into sand, and raised its arms in one last resort attempt to K the person sealing its power, while Tenzu was stuck in place as he continued the repression process. Too little, too late. Rasengan. Jiraiya appeared in Yamato's peripheral vision with his palm outstretched and holding a swirling chakra ball. The toad hermit slammed the ball into Shukaku's clawed hands. Both appendages were shredded apart into raw sand, and the Biju was powerless to resist being sealed back into its Jinchuriki. No, not like this, not when I've waited so long to be revived. Gra. The demon's TD screaming ceased when its head collapsed. Yamato and Jiraiya leapt back onto Gamabunta's shoulders, the Sannin grabbing Gaara as the monster's now soulless shell continued reducing into sand and crumbling into the swamp below. Once clear, the two shinobi abandoned that perch as well and moved onto somewhat solid ground, landing in the trees broken in Shukaku's rampage. Phew. Now that's what I call a nice little workout. I haven't gotten the old blood moving like that in a good while. Jiraiya let out a low whistle and pretended to wipe the non-existent sweat on his brow as he placed the still sleeping Gaara on the ground. Shukaku was no threat to emerge again, his Yuki having been sealed tight. Yamato took a step towards the Suna Nin, grunting with the numbing technique on his leg starting to lose its power. More than that, I should think. I appreciate the helping hand, Jiraiya-sama. The Sannin didn't respond, and Yamato turned to see him staring over at something with a bothered expression. Temari's corpse, which had somehow managed to not get mangled more than it had been to begin with during the previous battle. The toad hermit wrenched his tired gaze aside with a sickened snort, and Tenzu was rather ashamed at his earlier musings about the older man. Kids, people that age shouldn't get dragged into wars. These villagers will never learn. Old memories, Yamato assumed, and not pleasant ones. The captain knew as well as all Konoha nin worth their Hitai 8 that the Sannin had risen into prominence during the Second Great Shinobi War. This man's student had likewise become a legend during the Third. Past mistakes continued to repeat themselves, a never-ending circle. Tenzu wondered whether the toad hermit knew that Arashi-sama's son was headed down the exact same path as well. A strangled groan interrupted the captain's introspection. Sabaku no Gaara stirred and blinked, and tried to move into a seated position. Demonless or not, he was still a hostile shinobi, and Yamato neutralized him in a second, unsheathing his wooden katatana and pointing it at the Kazekage's son. Gaara stared down the blade with an apathetic expression, moving his hand in an attempt to call his san to bear. There was no response. I would not suggest resisting. This battle is over. You and Shukaku have both lost. Gaara remained silent a long moment, and at last crossed his arms and glared at Tenzu. I see. You'll be king me now then, I suppose. Therein was the captain's problem. The Sandaim's orders had been clear-cut. The Suna Jinchuriki was to be eliminated. Yamato had planned to leave the execution order to Naruto, who would have carried it out without hesitation and even taken a perverse pride in king in his idol's name. However, the blonde was at the moment MIA, and the captain had no constitution to a child, no matter what heinous acts Sabaku no Gaara had committed in his madness. He had ked children, even done so in the arena earlier, that Oto Kunoiki. However, an instinctive combat K and a cold-blooded M like this were not the same matter. Yamato raised his blade and began bringing it down, still sensing the toad hermit's exacting gaze on his back. And in mid-stroke, he maneuvered the weapon and struck Gaara with the handle on the kanji tattoo on his brow. The impact rendered him unconscious again, but was not lethal. Please escort this prisoner back to the village, Jiraiya-sama. I need to track down a subordinate who got separated earlier. Tenzu used Shunshin to vanish, giving the old man no chance to argue, and took leave knowing that he might well have condemned Gaara to something much worse than a quick execution. Ibiki and his pet sadists would have a grand old time grilling him over intel to be used in the inevitable counter-invasion against the Sand, and the scientists in Anbu R&D would likewise salivate over the chance to practice their cruelties and experiment on a live Jinchuriki, as the Sandaime had not allowed them to do to Naruto a long time ago when the ghouls had asked. Sarutobi would not extend such tender mercies to a war prisoner. The captain tried not to let such things burden his conscience, and instead set his mind to locating his errant lieutenant and giving him a proper ass chewing. You'd better hope you've got an acceptable excuse, Naruto, or else you'll learn that I'm not as forgiving as the old man. XXXXXXXXXXX. Naruto touched down on the pavement outside the Chunin exam arena and deactivated his cursed seal, causing his superhuman changes to regress and returning to his normal appearance. Konoha seemed to be a ghost town, as all shinobi were either at the arena or outside the village battling the invading armies, and the civilians had been evacuated into wartime shelters in the mountains rimming the village. The blonde took a sharp look at his appearance using a water puddle on the ground as a mirror, regarding his image with greater concentration than he had in the woods, when his mind was still burning with his battle against Kimimaro and blind rage towards Orochimaru. His shinobi garb was ruined, with countless holes in it where he'd been espered or SD, or his new Juin appendages had broken through. Naruto spat in irritation, activating a scroll he had stored in his pants pocket, and retrieved his old weighted leather trench coat, worn and stained with several past battles' blood. Donning his coat and attaching his katatana to the old place he'd made to hold his previous blade on the garments outside, he saw that the old coat wasn't able to cover the gaping wound in his chest, which was no longer bleeding but still raw and quite tender. The slow healing meant that it would leave him a noticeable scar. Better go and assess the situation, rather than charging in there blind. One near-death experience was enough. Rather than using the main entrance, the Jinchuriki leapt through an open window, landing in the second level and casting one last glance back towards the woods. Naruto had no worries about Teiko, as he now understood what that massive toad he'd seen while battling Kimimaro meant. That much had been obvious in retrospect. One person alone could have summoned that creature, and the Toad Sanon's presence would be more than enough to see the captain through his Biju situation, leaving the Med and reborn Naruto able to come back here in advance and do what he had to do. The blonde entered the Colosseum and started down the stone staircase towards where that battle had happened, not getting close enough to look at the barrier when a voice hailed him. Well now, look what the cat's hauled in, or perhaps it would be the snake. You're looking like hell there, kid. Naruto blinked and glanced at Asuma, who was smoking a cigarette while keeping his bearded mug trained on the barrier, and proceeded to ignore him, instead stumbling over near the terrace overlooking the Colosseum instead. Down in the combat hole, the Sand Ninbaki was impaled onto the lone tree with a long katatana slammed into his stomach, a bad spot to get hit that would have made him bleed to perish rather than allowing a mere instant K. Yugao's katatana that had once been her lover's, Naruto noticed with a small smirk. Two other Anbu blades pinned Baki's hands into the limbs high above his head. The message was clear: F with one and the entire corps will take revenge. Naruto wished the villagers had been awake to see the gruesome sight. The blonde wasn't able to see his vice-captain in the arena, and guessed she that must have gone to scout around elsewhere. Meanwhile, a woman's voice exhaled behind him. That's a terrible chest wound, Naruto-kun. Naruto shivered when a small hand touched the spot right below his bone flower wound. Kurenai examined the rough puncture hole with concerned horror in her crimson gaze. The blonde Jinchuriki would have liked to have had her caress his raw skin under normal circumstances, but at the moment, the whole mess was a regrettable distraction. He placed his hand over his ex-sensei's without looking at her and pried it loose, being as gentle as possible in doing so. Don't touch that, please, I don't need to have it reopening right this second. Naruto could almost sense her scowling, and became resigned to the inevitable. He so hated being mothered, or at least, he hated that he couldn't hate it as much as he wanted. The Jinchuriki also sensed an irritated stare on his back, and turned his head to see Asuma not outright scowling, but looking less than pleased with Kurenai doting on him. I'm going to bandage this now, and don't even think about struggling. Those two hands pulled his coat aside. Naruto cursed too late as the motion revealed the Anbu mask attached to his waist at his side, allowing all his various acquaintances, as Kakashi and Guy, and his entire cell were present there in addition to Asuma and Kurenai. Neji was still wearing a white hospital robe and slippers. Rather than being evacuated, he seemed to have chosen to assist in the arena. Kurenai seemed to produce bandages somehow. The blonde couldn't have guessed where in that wraparound dress she could have stored them and knew better than to ask, and cleaned and dressed his wound. The pressure caused a little blood to seep out, staining the bandages over his heart red. You were outside the village earlier, Naruto-kun. Perhaps. Naruto knew what Hatake Kakashi wanted to ask without needed to be told, to learn how his precious Uchiha Sasuke was. The blonde had no interest in indulging the silver-haired man at the present moment, however, and instead chose to mess with him a little, acting casual whilst mentioning the composite genin team he'd crossed paths with earlier on. Yeah, I ran into them. Some nitwit thought it'd be a smart idea to order genin to pursue a raging demon container. Genius move, that. The demon vessel sneered over at Kakashi, who gave no response other than a shrug. Whatever his motivations had been in assigning that mission, the Sharingan warrior seemed to have no interest in explaining his actions to some teenager. Asuma and Kurenai both sent cold glares towards him, as their students had been chosen to go with Kakashi's most expendable soldier on what could have been a mission. However, rather than chastise his colleague, the bearded shinobi turned back to the preoccupied Naruto with a low growl. You met with, and abandoned them, knowing well the danger those kids were in. Naruto massaged his temples and scowled at Asuma, though he was at the same time pleased to note that the older man hadn't tossed his name in with the kids. The Jinchuriki was worried about Kiba and the others as well, but the mess wasn't his making. The blonde wasn't taking the heat on this one. Oi. Don't start blaming me here, Gramps. I'm not the irresponsible twit who sent those rookies out there. I'm here to assist Sandaime Hokage-sama, not be the undesignated guard to some new minted genin who shouldn't have ever been given that mission. The man seemed to relent at that and took another long drag on his cigarette, then pointing it over at the violet barrier atop the cage's viewing area, inside which Orochimaru and the third continued to battle while wearing a concerned look. Naruto removed towards the railing. He placed the weathered garment inside its scroll again and girded his katatana on his back. He'd wasted too much time making pointless conversation. Hate to break the bad news, kiddo, but that barrier is nigh impenetrable and too high to pass over. You'd better have some wings hidden underneath those bandages or something. We're all sitting on pins and needles worried about the Hokage too, but we can't get in there. Asuma couldn't have chosen a better lead in comment. Naruto took a calming breath and pulled on his chakra again, pumping power into his cursed seal to begin the activation process, pushing the Juin onto the second level. His muscles swelled as the metamorphosis commences, pulling apart the bandages Kurenai had put on a moment earlier, and he spread his white wings to their complete span. Without looking back to see how the others reacted to his enhanced appearance, the now long-haired blonde bounded down along the arena wall to gain momentum and took to the skillies, at last turning his head when he reached his previous height again. Hey, that's no problem. I'll be back in a little while, with Orochimaru's head. Naruto paused a moment on hearing Kakashi's usual drawl behind him. You're not thinking about going in there alone, I hope. The blonde smirked and stared into the barrier while gliding in midair. I met death to gain these new powers, and still lived. I won't lose this time either. Naruto soared high into the air and looked down into the barrier, which also seemed to have a closed top. The serpent monster careened over closer and reached out to brush his hand against the wicked purple chakra, sensing some strange resonation with its vile presence. The blonde scaled hand pressed into the barrier, and became heated as the Juin on his end throbbed with some strange harmonious accord, but other than that he remained unharmed. The spot where his hand made contact glowed a moment and the purple chakra swirled aside, leaving an opening. Perhaps the chakra in his seal made the encampment recognize some connection to Orochimaru and let him pass. Regardless, the evolved Naruto darted into the hole and emerged on the other side. The hole in the barrier closed again when he had passed. Alright then, here I come, Hokage-sama. Naruto needed a mere moment to locate his target. Sarutobi was bound in position with tree limbs while Orochimaru made seals and prepared to execute a king technique. Two men clad in red and blue samurai armor stood to the serpent man's either side, looking on with stoic expressions. He recognized them as the Shodai and Nadaime, though he was also quite sure those two particular men were supposed to be resting in the graves. The cursed monster's considerable rage peaked once again at seeing his mentor about to be made. The harsh sunlight overhead burned into his back, and he expelled his monstrous chakra and shouted his arrival to the entire world, or at least to the small world inside the barrier, and glided onto the ground between Sarutobi and Orochimaru. That ought to get the Vair's attention. You're looking rather well, Naruto-kun, the seal has evolved as I'd guessed. I hope Kimimaro-kun wasn't too boring. Naruto glanced at the grinning Orochimaru, and then turned his back to the snake while unsheathing his katatana. He somehow knew the Sannin wouldn't attack, would instead observe his experiment in motion. The serpent creature imagined Orochimaru's expression coming alive with twisted glee when he turned an blade on the Sandaime. The Hokage meanwhile stared at his new evolved persona with some wonder and a little sadness, but the old man seemed relieved to see him overall, and not in the least concerned about Naruto harming him. The Jinchuriki SD Sarutobi's wooden bonds to pieces with two quick hacks and caught the Hokage in his arms as he sank to the ground. You're supposed to be out in the woods with Yamato, not here. Naruto knew what the Hokage was thinking, that he had abandoned his mission. The Sandaime wasn't wrong in the technical sense, but there was no time to explain the overall situation. He would have his chance to give his side later, when the battle was completed. I know, but we got separated and then a gut instinct told me that I needed to come back here. Rest a minute and recover, Hokage-sama, and leave handling this worthless SC to me. I've got a little score to settle with Orochimaru. I'll make him live to regret turning me into this. The cursed Naruto returned his Anbu blade back inside its holster and stared down his pale-skinned nemesis. A sudden wind made Orochimaru's long hair billow out. How reprehensible, Naruto-kun. You're still siding with a village that sees you as a monster. You could become a peerless shinobi in the sound, a marvelous warrior whose mere mention strikes terror into all who hear it spoken. There's still time to reconsider. Sarutobi now and come over to me, and I'll overlook this minor transgression. Naruto vanished in a multicolored blur and zipped inside Orochimaru's personal space almost quicker than the older man could register. There was no shunshin involved, nothing but raw speed. The blonde socked the snake man in the gut hard enough to push him back a couple steps. Orochimaru wheezed and lurched over, clutching his stomach, hacking and exhaling his hot, stagnant breath against the demon carrier's green scales. Go to hell. I'll never turn traitor. I'm no one's slave, and I'm nothing like Kimimaro. The blonde abomination rushed in within an arm's reach to Orochimaru again using his Jun-enhanced speed and grabbed onto the reeling Sannin's long black hair, snatching the purple rope sash around his waist with the other hand. Naruto heard the Anbu outside whisper amongst themselves at his amazing new powers, and sneered with his sinister lips as he pushed the serpent man into the ground with his much superior might. You're going to see what happens to someone dumb enough to get me pissed. You've made this personal. Here comes the pain, old man. Naruto heaved Orochimaru high into the air with both hands, sending him spinning. The Jinchuriki gave a loud war shout and began glowing with chakra, soaring into the air and crushing the incredulous Sannin's mandible with a rising uppercut. Like a malevolent burning comet he moved in and out, battering the shell-shocked Orochimaru with rushing punches and kicks in midair and never letting him plummet back to the ground. The noise in the arena grew ever louder, and a passing glance told Naruto that the sleeping genjutsu on the spectators had been cancelled, and the villagers were beginning to stir. As he and Orochimaru rose nearer to the barrier's ceiling, Naruto climbed even higher and launched into a somersault in midair to maximize his momentum, and at last lashed the serpent man back towards the ground using his smooth-muscled tail. Orochimaru landed on his back with an earth-shattering crunch, splintering the ceiling tiles beneath him on his impact. Alright, this is the finisher. The serpentine demon container whipped out his katatana and held it in both hands. His angel wings shimmered with a pale silver light as he once again charged in behind his twitching opponent at even greater speed than the last time. Orochimaru saw the king strike coming and motioned with his hand as though to call something. Naruto paid no attention to whatever it was, but he noticed that the Shodai and Nadaime seemed lost in space without the Sannin giving them mental commands, which was in line with what Anko had told him regarding the Edo Tensei resurrection Kinjutsu. Orochimaru's expression widened in shock when his call went unanswered and he rolled to the side to avoid being cleaved in pieces. The Snake Sannin went on the run, evading innumerable rapid-speed katatana strokes with his serpentine grace, at last smirking wide when Naruto made another high-speed rush. Ku, such overwhelming power, Naruto-kun, but simple might on its own isn't quite enough to compete at this level. You're overmatched, kid. Orochimaru halted in his backpedaling and allowed Naruto's momentum to send him rushing past the Snake Man and to almost crash into the mud wall where Sarutobi had been bound on his arrival. The Sannin shot his purple tongue at the blonde, who waited until the last second and executed a surprise Kawarimi to exchange places with his katatana. The Serpent Man's extendable appendage wrapped around the light blade and Naruto stuck it into the mud wall, perplexing his opponent long enough to allow the Jinchuriki to zip in and barge his shoulder into the mad criminal's ribs. I'm experienced enough. You're ancient and I'm not, and that's all that separates us. The Sannin blocked Naruto's attempt to press his attack, retracting his tongue and clamping onto the blonde's scaled wrist with more strength than one would guess a thin, pallid-colored man such as Orochimaru to possess. The Sannin leered down at his opponent, pure malice shining in his pale visage. Don't be absurd, little Kitsune. I've been clever enough to avoid the ravages old age brings, unlike miserable Sarutobi back there. I'm reaping all the countless advantages experience gives without ever having to tolerate wrinkles or liver spots. Too bad things ended like this. I'd have loved to have shown such a handsome tiger the tricks I've mastered. You can have this instead now. Gogyu Fuan. Naruto recoiled with a sick stomach as he listened to the man's perverse innuendo, and almost got caught unawares with the sudden sneak attack that came with the words. While no sealing master, the Jinchuriki had learned enough about the basic concepts in his research into the one on his stomach to comprehend that getting struck with an odd-numbered seal would wreak havoc on his chakra. The digits on Orochimaru's right hand glowed purple and the serpent moved to slam the hand into his gut. Naruto likewise gripped onto Orochimaru's wrist in time to block the sealing. The blonde's position let him see something that his opponent couldn't, and he released his grip on the Sannin and leapt aside rather than continuing with a strength test that he would have won. Sarutobi slid into Orochimaru's legs with a running sweep, causing the man to hiss in pain as he lost his balance. The Sandaime punched him in the stomach and ended with a high crane kick to knock the Serpent Man crashing into the wall. Sarutobi turned to his protector with a grim smile. I'd be a piss-poor Hokage to sit back and let someone else risk death to protect me. Naruto had a sudden insight and raised his arm to the side, catching an incoming kick at the ankle. The evolved Shinobi turned to look clear into the Nadaime's white-haired visage. The blonde likewise twisted and the Shodai missed with a running punch, and Naruto grabbed his long hair and held the reincarnated hero tight. Sarutobi sighed and pointed at the two warrior brothers. The twin explosive notes that the Sandaime had planted on the Shodai's leg as well as the Nadaime's shoulder much earlier in the contest activated in unison, crippling both men. Naruto whirled around and swung the Nadaime into the wall where Orochimaru was regaining his balance while rubbing his leg, and then power pressed the Shodai over his head with both hands and hurled him into the other two. The evil master and his two puppets collapsed in tight-angled limbs. We've got this sad bastard on the ropes now. Another barrage should end this. Sarutobi nodded and began making hand signs. Orochimaru was buried beneath his two pawns and struggling to push them loose, but their listless nature was making his work harder than it should have been, as were the tight-angled robes he was garbed in. No matter what the situation, the Sandaime intended to give him no escape chances this time. Naruto watched as the old man steeled his resolve to end his living nightmare. I couldn't agree more. You know what to do now, Naruto. For Konoha's sake, we must bring an end to this battle. Naruto knew the seal sequence his mentor was using, and rushed to mirror it at a more rapid pace in order to complete at the same time as the third. A single prevailing thought repeated in the container's mind as he made the last seal. Not for Konoha, for me. Two voices cried out as one, and Orochimaru's pale complexion turned whiter still. Kaiten, Kuryu Enden. Fire SN out in two massive streams through each shinobi's respective mouth and combined into one single mammoth blast. The Grand Dragon roared to the heavens and plowed into the three shinobi and the wall behind them, blasting a huge hole in the rock wall that spawned cracks along the remainder. The wall at last collapsed under the pressure and red-hot rocks rained down onto the three shinobi trapped underneath. Neither the Shodai nor Nadai made so much as a single sound as their revived B were baked and reduced to ashes underneath the rubble, as even the special tagged kunai binding their recalled souls into those cheap huskilils were melted into sludge, while Orochimaru wailed out a TD screech loud enough to compensate. Sarutobi walked over towards the smoldering rubble and sighed with a pleased smile. Well done, Naruto, well done. That had to have done the trick. We've won. Naruto sighed as well, but in pain as he regressed back to his normal appearance. The blonde had known such exhaustion in the past, when Kyuubi no Kitsune had overexerted his presence in the battle with Zabuza, and when Orochimaru had stuck the Juin on him, messing about his entire chakra alignment. This was much worse. More than his tenketsu being overloaded, his actual muscles seemed to be wounded as well. Naruto knew he'd need a week or 8's rest to even be able to move again once the adrenaline subsided. The Jinchuriki ran a hand through his hair, noticing that his spiked locks had lengthened somewhat with his seal evolution. I get a haircut now, thing wonderful. We damned better have, I'd be pissed to see someone survive that unscathed. Naruto moved to sheath his katatana again, and realized that he had last used it to pin Orochimaru's tongue to the wall. A wall which was now obliterated, with the rubble smoldering at near magma-like temperatures. The blonde stomped the ground, sending pain lancing into his leg, and launched into a silent cursing storm that would have made the mutt blush with pride. A brand new, custom-made prized Anbu katatana, melted into S. Though he would never curse so much in Sarutobi's presence, the old man seemed to guess what had him so angered, and placed a hand on the blonde's shoulder. I'll have another one commissioned, and a much better one. You've earned that much. Naruto laughed at having been seen through with such ease, and saw something else stuck on the ground near a water puddle. As the Jinchuriki walked towards the small item, he began to notice that all the Konoha nin assembled in the arena had started to gather around the barrier, cheering and making motions towards Orochimaru's mutant henchmen, who still held the encampment in place, but with paling expressions. Naruto bent over and took his small prize, handing the wooden pipe over to its owner. I was wondering where this vanished to. How in the hell it managed to get over here. The Hokage glanced at his pipe and considered it a moment, and then smirked and tossed his one vice into the rubble. Some lingering tobacco inside the pipe burned and sent its pleasant aroma into the air as the wooden item burnt to ash alongside it. Naruto was puzzled. There was something so wrong about envisioning Sandaime Sarutobi without his pipe. Hokage-sama. The old man snorted, watching his old possession burn with a Cheshire grin. No more smoking. I've been granted a new lease, and I'm not going to waste it on that. From where the pipe had been tossed, a cold and poisonous voice rang into the air. That doesn't matter. You'll shrivel into a raisin and S sooner or later, old man. Naruto moved to guard the Hokage as a person materialized through the rubble, appearing where the pipe's ashes were. Orochimaru was in miserable shape. His pale skin was charred black in several places, his robes burnt to cinders. The Sanin's right arm was hanging there, smoldering and black, bleeding and looking as though it would break loose at the slightest motion. Sarutobi glared at his wounded student. Orochimaru, all that, and still. Orochimaru motioned with his remaining hand, and the barrier shuddered and vanished. The Snake Man's henchmen moved to surround him, glaring down at Naruto and Sarutobi. Neither Konoha nin paid them mind, concentrating complete attention on the burnt master. The remaining shinobi began streaming into the area now that the barrier was gone, taking protective positions to guard the Hokage, as well as the pariah who had risen to become a hero in this battle. Naruto glanced about and spotted Kurenai and the others among them. I will not be ked here, sensei. I will survive on and recover, and return to Konoha with even more power to revenge this humiliation. You've managed to win this little sortie, so revel in it while there's still time. This was the beginning, and nothing more. Naruto, somehow emboldened to make his presence known even with all these other elite shinobi watching and listening when he once would have hung back and observed, sneered at Orochimaru. The nightmarish snake Sanin now seemed more like a paper tiger. The blonde's comrades weren't inclined to agree with his casual threat assessment, as several Konoha nin began producing weapons and molding chakra. You can stop blowing out S now, Snake. Your ass got toasted, at least pretend to be a man and admit it. The Snake Man's goons all glared daggers at the audacious blonde. Naruto was less than impressed with the king intent that slammed into him. This quartet combined wasn't equal to what Kimimaro had been alone, much less Orochimaru, or Uchiha Itachi and Hoshigaki Kisame, or Momoki Zabuza. The enraged Heavy Sennin smirked through charred lips, sending Naruto an almost pitied look, as though he were too slow to grasp something obvious. It'll become clearer soon enough now that the scales have been ruptured. Yamata, Sarutobi-sensei, Naruto-kun. Orochimaru's guards tossed down smoke bombs and retreated, the obese Gaki with the mohawk grabbing the Sannin and bringing him with them. An Anbu captain made a universal pursuit signal and his men began to assemble into the proper order, but the Sandaime checked his personal soldiers with a raised hand. The nameless captain seemed less than pleased with being overruled, but complied with the unspoken command nonetheless. Sarutobi shook his aged head with a knowing expression. Don't pursue. A wounded beast is the most lethal sort. No need to waste lives now. We've all succeeded in guarding the village. Naruto's lingering strength gave out at last, and he stumbled over amidst too loud shouting and congratulations to a more secluded location underneath the Shodai's grove and plopped down onto the tile, propping his hands behind his spiked blonde head. The Jinchuriki gazed into the skillies like one Nara Shikamaru was known to. However, quite unlike the slacker, he had no interest in watching plain and boring old clouds, and instead stared at the brilliant rainbow that was beginning to vanish in the sun's light. Protect those people most precious to you, perhaps there is something to it after all. This time, not even a complaining Kyuubi no Kitsune could put a damper on his good mood. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.